Hello and welcome. I'm Dave. Today we will learn about Python lists and tuples, and I'll provide links to all resources in the description below. Hey, before we get started on today's lesson about lists and tuples, I want to go back and make one correction in the previous lesson. I did make an annotation there. I've already changed the GitHub source code, but if you missed that annotation or haven't looked at the source code, I just want to change this for you. On line 18, where we check the player with an if statement, I wasn't thinking and I used the bitwise or. We should have just used the actual word or right here. This will make all the difference as far as how this if statement works for you. We're learning about lists and tuples today, and you can see I have an empty folder named Lesson 6 over here in the top left. We're going to create a new file, and let's name this file lists.py. And then before we type any code inside of our Python file, let's go ahead and move the terminal, which I can open with Control and the backtick. Let's move it to the right if you don't have it over on the right side. So I'm going to choose View and then Appearance, scroll down to Panel Position and choose Right. And now our terminal is over here, our Python file's here, and then I'm going to press Control B to go ahead and hide the file tree that was over here. Now, lists are one of 4 collection data types in Python, and what they do is hold multiple values, and then we can reference those values with a common name. So for example, I could say users, then I could set this equal to a list, and inside the list I could put Dave and maybe John, and how about Sarah? So now we have a list of users, so 3 values in one list, and we just refer to it as the name users. But of course, it's not limited to just string data type or any one data type. So I could just call a list here data, set this equal to a list that has, say, my name, number 42, and Boolean data like true, and that's also a valid list. Or it can even be empty. So I'll just call this empty list, and I'll set it equal to an empty list, and that is also a valid list. So now let's say you're working with one of these lists, but you don't know what's inside it, and you want to check to see if a value is inside of it. So let's do that. I'm going to use a print statement here so we can see the output, and I'll just say Dave, which is a value that's in 2 of our lists, and I can say in users, and let's see what we get in the console. After we Control S to save our file, then we can go up here by our play button and choose Run Python File, and let's see what we get. It says true over here. So yes, Dave is in users. So let's switch this to data, Control S to save again, and I'll click the play button, and we've got true again. So now let's see if Dave is in the empty list. Control S to save, click play, and that output is false. So now let's say we want to get a specific item from a list and we know what position it is in. And we have to remember that lists start with a 0 index. So Dave would be at the 0 position. So here I could say users, and then I can use a bracket and put 0. Now this should print Dave to our output terminal over here. So once again, click play, and we've got false because we had that above, and now we have Dave as well. And now I'm going to copy this down by clicking on line 9 where you see my print statement, and use Shift Alt and the down arrow to just copy that line of code. And now instead of using the position of the value we want, if we want to know the last value in our list, we could also use a -1. So I will save that and run, and let's see what we get. Yep, we've got Sarah, which is the last value in our list. So likewise, we could use a -2, and now let's run this code again, and we've got John. So it does accept negative numbers also. Now, if we want to know the position of a specific value, we can use a method. So I'm going to say print, and I'll say users once again, and then dot index, and let's find out the index of Sarah inside of the users list. So now that I have passed the string Sarah to index, we get position 2 returned here in our output. And now what if we want a range of values? Maybe we want the first and second value. We can also do that. So I'll start with print once again so we can see the output, and I'll say users. And now with bracket notation, let's start at 0. And let's go to the second position. But note, this will not include the value at the second position. So save and run the code, and we get a list returned that has only Dave and John from the 0 and the first position in our list. And now I'm going to copy this code down again with Shift Alt and the down arrow, and let's say we wanted everything from the first position to the end of the list, no matter how many entries were inside of our list. Well, then we just wouldn't provide an ending value, but we would start at the first position. So now I'll say Control S to save the file again and run this, and notice we get John and Sarah. So by providing the first position here in the first slot of the range, it does include John. However, when we provided the second position as the last slot in the range, it did not include Sarah. And now, as you might guess, this could also accept negative numbers. So let me provide a full range here, like -3 to -1, and let's see what we get. So I'll save this, run the code, and we got Dave and John again. So that is the same as saying 0 to 2, because it did not include Sarah because she's at the -1 position, but it did start at the -3 position, which is the equivalent in our list to 0. I'm going to scroll up for a little more room, and we should note we can use the length function, which is len, and then use parentheses, and pass in a list like users, or we could pass in data that we created above, and this will return the length of our list. So I'll Control S to save, run our code again, and you can see we've got 3 here because we have 3 items in the list. So note that doesn't start counting at 0 like the index of our list that has 0, 1, and 2 when we have 3 items. It actually returns the length, which is 3 because we have 3 items in the list. And now let's say we have an existing list like users and we want to add more items to our list. And we can do that with the append method. So I'm going to say users.append, and I'm going to add Elsa to our users list. And then I just need to print users so we can see the end result. Control S to save, run the code, and now our list of users has Dave, John, Sarah, and Elsa in the list. And what if we have another list that has users and we want to add those to our previously existing users list? I will show you a couple of ways to do that. One is to take our list, users, and say plus equals, and then add the other list. So I'll create another list here and I'll put in Jason inside of this list. So a list with just one item, and then we'll once again need to print users to see the output, and then we'll run the file. And now our users list has Dave, John, Sarah, Elsa, and Jason. So we added those 2 lists together, if you will, because this is a list, although it only has 1 item, and we had a previous list named users. Now the other way to do this is with the extend method. So we could say users.extend, and I could pass in another list. So I could say I've got a list with Robert, and let's put somebody else in here. So after Robert, let's just pick another name, say Jimmy. And now we're adding this list to our users list. So once again, I'll need to print users to see the end result. We'll run the code. And now we've got a lot of people in our list because we've got Dave, John, Sarah, Elsa, Jason, Robert, and Jimmy all in our users list. And now something to note about this first method here. Make sure if you use this that it is indeed a list, because if you were to do this without the brackets, let me go ahead and delete these, and then we'll run our code. Let's see what happens in the output. Notice it entered every individual letter as a list item from Jason's name. So that's not what you want. You want to make sure you have brackets here if you're using the plus equals, because if not, it considers every letter and item to be added to that list. Now here I created new lists to add to our users list when I used extend or when I used the plus equals above, but we could also just pass in a pre-existing list. So let me do that now with users.extend, and I'm just going to pass in our data list. Now we'll print users once again, and I'll run the code, and let's see what we get. Now, our previous list had Dave, 42, and True, and that's all been added to our users list. That may not be what we want, but of course it does work that way. So you can just pass in a list name because we're referring to that full list up here as data, and that also works. We really don't want this mixed data in here though with 42 and true. It's a valid list, there's no problem with it, but it doesn't make sense as users. So I'm just going to highlight both of these, press Control and the slash to comment out both lines at once. Now, something to note about all of the ways we added to our list, it added the items at the end of the list. And so we see all the new items here at the very end of each list, but we can pick our spot. I'm going to scroll up for a little more room so we can add to our file, and I will type something like users.insert because we're going to insert into our list, and this is the insert method. I want to insert at the very first position, so I'll say 0, that's the index position, and I'm going to put Bob's name in our users list. So I will print users once again, and we'll see if Bob is added to the beginning of our list when we run the code. And yes, we see Bob now at the beginning of the list. We can also use bracket notation, so I'll say users, and after that bracket notation, and I want to insert maybe more than one value at the second position slot. I don't want to replace any of the values that are in our list. I just want to insert 2 extra values. So I've picked the second position, and notice how I say it's not only going to begin, but it's going to end right there. So I'm not replacing any of the other values. And now let's have a new list, and I'll put in Eddie and Alex, and we'll print users again so we can see that output. Save the file, run the code, and we should see Eddie now in the second position, Alex in the third position, but we didn't lose our previous values here where we had Dave, John, and Sarah inside of, here's the first position, second position, Sarah in the third. Now Dave is still in the first position, but now John has been moved from the second position to the fourth position, and Sarah is still there as well. So this insert just made room for Eddie and Alex, and we once again picked our spot. But now let's look at how we can replace values. So here I'll say users, and we'll use bracket notation again, and we'll start at the first position, and we'll end at the third position. Now let's set this equal to another list, and here we'll put in Robert, and let's put it, well, we have a Jimmy already. Let's put in JPJ. That should work. And we'll print users again. And let's see what happens to the last version of our list compared to the one before it. So now Robert is in the first position and JPJ is in the second position. So we replaced Dave and Eddie, what was in the first and second positions. It stopped at the third position, but notice it did not replace what was in the third position or who was in the third position, and that was Alex. So it works much the same way as we return values, how we specified this range in here, and this is also referred to as a slice. So we're referring to a slice, but here we were very specific, saying start and end at that same position. So it did not replace any of the other values, but this actually did replace 2 values in our previous list. Now, if we can add data to a list, we should be able to remove it as well. So let's go over how we do that. I'll scroll for some more room. And the first thing we'll do is look at the remove method. So I could say users.remove, and I could specify the user that I want to remove from my list. I want to remove Bob. So let's check the list afterwards, again with a print statement. Run, and we'll check our list. And now Robert is the first position here in the index position of 0. Previously, it was Bob. So Bob is no longer in our list. Now we can also pop off the last user from the list or the last item from any list, and we do that with the pop method. But I also want to point out that the pop method will return that value even though it removes it from the list. So here I'm just going to say print users.pop, and we'll call that pop method. And then let's run the code, and we'll see that it actually returns Jimmy. Jimmy was the last value in our list. But now if we look at our list again, and I'm just going to Control-C to copy and Control-V to paste this down here. We'll look at the list value afterwards. So we have Jimmy here, but Jimmy is no longer in our users list. Now we can also delete a specific user or a specific item from a list with the keyword del, which stands for delete. So I'll say users, and now I can specify the user that I want to remove from the list. Let's once again just go to that first position in the list, the 0 index, And so now this should delete Robert from the first position in our list. And of course, we won't know until we once again print the users list afterwards. So I'll paste that down there. Let's run our code and let's check the list. And yes, JPJ is now first in our list. Robert is no longer first. You can also use this delete keyword to delete a list completely. So let's go back to that data list, and I'll say del for delete and then data. And now let's check this by trying to print the data list, and I'm expecting to get an error. Let's see what happens. We run our code, and yes, Python doesn't like that. It says data is not defined. So we deleted it entirely. Even though it's defined up higher in our file, by the time we get to this print statement, it is not defined. So I'm going to comment this out, and instead of deleting it and causing an error like that, I'm going to use the clear method. So I could say data.clear. Once we call that clear method, it will empty our list, but the list will still exist. So now when we run this, it returns an empty list here on line 52. Now that we've added, removed, inserted, and modified lists, maybe we want to go ahead and sort those lists as well. So let's scroll for a little more room. And underneath our last clear statement and print statement, let's add users.sort. And after that, we'll once again print users. And let's look at what happens to our list of users. So now it is alphabetical. We've got Alex, Elsa, JPJ, Jason, John, Robert, and Sarah. But notice something else. They all start with capitals. So what if we put something in here as lowercase? So let's do that. I'm going to do it before we sort. So I'll just put it right above here, and I'll say at users, and let's put it in the, whoops, not the curly brace, we need the bracket. Let's start at the first position and end at the second. So we're replacing Elsa with whatever we insert here. Now I'm going to insert Dave once again, but make Dave all lowercase. And so now let's check out our code. And oh, I forgot to put it in brackets. This is what I warned you about. Notice it inserted the letters individually and it organized them, but they're all at the end. And that's the point that I want to get to about this, because when it's lowercase, it comes after the uppercase. So I'll save this and run it again. And now we can see Dave is at the very end of the list. So what we want is Dave inserted alphabetically here as well. And we can do that. We just need to change what we're doing. And by the way, we replaced Alex with the insert because Alex was in the first position. John is still in here. So Alex was replaced by the lowercase Dave. Okay, so since we have determined that lowercase comes after all of the uppercase, we need to pass something to the sort that will help Dave get inserted in the correct order. Actually, Dave is inserted at that first position and then it is sorted. So we're just going to do another sort after the first one here. So I'll copy both of those, put it underneath, but we need to pass in an option here to the sort. So we're going to say key equals str, which stands for string, dot lower. So once we do that, and we go ahead and run our code again, we can see that it is now in an alphabetical order, and Dave comes first just because it is a D. The letter D comes in the alphabet before E. So really what we needed to do was pass in this key equals string dot lower to include the lowercase in the correct alphabetical order. Note these are all strings also, so if we were sorting two different data types, it really wouldn't work as expected. It should be all the same data type. You couldn't call this on a data type that wasn't string even. So you need to make sure you have the same type of data when you're sorting it. So now, speaking of that, let's look at some numbers. I'm going to create another list called nums, and inside of it I'll put 4, 42, 78, 1, and 5. Just some random numbers, really. And after that, we'll say nums.reverse. Now, this is different than sorting. It actually flips the array, and I want to look at this because I don't want you to confuse the reverse method with reverse when we pass it into our sort function. So nums.reverse, and we will print nums, and you'll see that the array, or not the array, the list, this looks just like what I call an array in JavaScript, but it's a list in Python. So our list is now in the reverse order of what it was over here in our code, beginning with 4 and ending with 5. It now begins with 5 and ends with 4. So we already know how to sort something in the ascending order with numbers, which would be just to use the sort method like we did on users. So it would start with 1 and work its way up to 78. But now let's sort in reverse with our nums array. And to do that, I need to say nums.sort, and I'm going to pass in reverse equals true. And after that, let's print nums once again. And we'll see that it's different than it was with our reverse method that just flipped the list around. So now when we run the code, we actually get it descending instead of ascending. So it's 78, 42, 5, 4, and finally the number 1. Something we need to note about all the different sort approaches we have used here is that they modify the existing list. So notice when I print users after I have sorted, I'm just printing the list. So it has definitely changed. It doesn't keep the same order that it previously had. And the same with any of these others. I'm just printing nums after as well. So what if we want to keep the original list the way it was, but yet sort the list just for an individual purpose? Well, we can do that. There's a couple of ways. One is to use the global approach here, the global sorted function. So I'm needing to print now because it's not going to give me a second line that I could just print nums, for example, with, because it's not going to change if I print nums after. So I'll do that as well, but I'm going to call the sorted function, and I'm going to call it on the nums list, and then I can just pass in my option right here. So reverse equals true as well. I'm going to comment this out so we didn't modify it before. So when we did use nums, we modified it here, and we'll see that print. I'm going to actually print the result of the global sorted function here, and we pass in nums and then pass in our reverse option right there. So now let's run our code. We should see really the same thing we returned from this, except our original array is not modified. So if I were to print nums once again after this statement, it should still look like it starts with 5 and ends with 4. So let's try that. Print nums here and run the code again. And yes, so here is our sorted array, but here is I said array again. I'm going to occasionally mess that up because I'm talking about lists, but it looks just like an array in JavaScript. Here is our list, and this is the same order we had before we sorted it. So this does not modify the original. It just returns that sorted list for that one time, and that's using the global sorted function. Now, another approach we could take is to make a copy of the original list and then sort that copy, so we would still have our original list. I'm going to scroll just a little, and I'll show you 3 different ways to make a copy. One, I'll call this nums copy, and we'll set this equal to our list nums dot copy, and that will create a copy. We could also say my nums, and we'll set this equal to the constructor here for a list. And now we'll just pass in nums, and this creates a copy of our original list nums. And the third way we could do this, and I'm just randomly naming these things here, so I have my copy now. We'll set this equal to nums, and we'll specify an index range here, but really we're not going to specify the beginning or the end. So it's just going to slice the full list and store it in my copy. So it's once again a copy. All 3 of these are actual copies of the original. So now let me go ahead and copy our print nums here, and then I'll paste it here, and then I'm going to use Shift Alt and the down arrow 3 times. So I have 4 print statements. The first one's going to be the nums copy, and the second one is going to be my nums. And the third one should be my copy. And after I that's not right. Let's paste that in. And now let's go ahead and print all of these lists, and let's see what we get. So they all kind of look the same here after we printed those, and it should be the last 4 actually, but they're not all the same. And that's because these 3 are copies. So let's go ahead and sort any one of these here. So let's just call sort on the third one. And we'll see that our original nums still does not change. Oh, and I tried to print the sort statement. What I should do is sort right before, and then I should just try to print my copy. So there we go. Let's remove this. So my copy.sort, and then print my copy. And that's why we had none there instead. So let's do this now. There we go. So here is the sorted my copy list, but here is the original nums list. Just a couple more things before we're finished with lists. One is to go ahead and say that we can check the type of lists, just like we did any other data type. And that is, say, with type, and then we just pass in our list. So I'll pass in nums. And now when we run this, we will see that it is a class list type here. So this is our data type that we received from the type function. After that, we can also, or we should also note that we can create a list, much like we did up here by passing in a list or a list structure to the list constructor. And that's how we created the copy of my nums. But if I wanted to create a new list, and let's just call this my list, I could use that list constructor, and then inside I would just create this list. And so I'll say something like 1, and we'll put in Neil, and then let's put in a true. And after that, we should be able to print my list as well. Now notice earlier, we didn't really use that constructor, and we were still able to keep the list or create the list, but it should be noted that you can create a list this way as well. So let's save that, run the code one more time, and here is the list we created with the constructor. And that covers lists for today, but the next data collection type we'll look at is tuples. So let's start learning about those. Tuples are very much like lists, except the data inside the tuples will not change, and the order the data is in will not change. So let's create a tuple, and we can do that with the constructor. So we'll type tuple in parentheses, and then we need parentheses again inside of this, and I'll just put in some random values as well, much like I had for the data list above, I guess. And now we have created a tuple with a constructor. We could also create it without the constructor. So here I could say another tuple and just set this equal to one set of parentheses, and I'll put in some random numbers. This is also a tuple, and we can verify that. So let's go ahead and print one of these. I'll say my tuple, so we just see what it looks like when it prints out. And then let's print the type function again, or the result of the type function when we pass in my tuple. Then I'm going to press Shift Alt and the down arrow, and then I'll put another tuple in here as well, just so we can verify both of these are tuples. And here we'll run the code. So we see here is the output of the tuple. It has parentheses instead of brackets. And then you can see both of the tuples we created when we check the type do indeed say tuple. Now, most of what we've already learned about lists also applies to tuples, but we have to keep in mind that tuples cannot be changed. However, if we need to do something with a tuple, we can get creative and copy it. So let's look at how we do that. First of all, I'll create a variable here called new list. I'm going to set it equal to the list constructor, and then I'm going to pass in my tuple. So this will create a new list out of my tuple. And then I'm going to say new list, and I'll append a new value, and I'll just add the value Neil. After that, now let's go ahead and create a new tuple, and we'll set this equal to the tuple constructor, and we'll pass in the new list. So now when I print new tuple, we'll have a new tuple with the value Neil added. The original tuple, my tuple, will not have changed, but we'll have a new tuple that did add the value that we needed to add to that. So now let's go ahead and run the code, and we see our new tuple here that has Neil added to it. When we assign values to a tuple, as we do with another tuple up here, that is called packing the tuple. So likewise, we can unpack a tuple, and we can unpack it into new variable names. So I don't have any specific name picked out here. I'll just call the first one 1, the next one 2, and let's call the last one here hey, but I'm going to start it with an asterisk, and you'll see why. So I'll set this equal to another tuple, but we are unpacking. You can see we're putting values into these variable names. So now I'm going to print each variable name. So I'll print 1, print 2, And I'll also print hey, and let's see what each one of these holds. So when we run our code, variable 1 holds the number 1, variable 2 holds the number 4, and hey holds the remaining values. And notice they're unpacked into a list. But it doesn't have to be the last one either. So we could remove the asterisk from hey and instead put it in front of our variable 2. And now let's go ahead and save and run this code again. And you'll notice now we get the value 1 inside of the first variable, and the value 8 is inside of hey, but everything in between goes to the variable 2, and it's a list, so it has the values inside of a list. A final note about lists and tuples in VS Code, and that is we can check what methods are available on a list or a tuple just using dot notation. So I'll say print, and I'll pull in the data list that I had earlier, and type a dot, a period, and then we see a list of all the different methods that we can call on our list that is called data. So that is one way to check what methods are available. So let's put in the name of our tuple. So we had another tuple, and I'll once again have to delete the period, type it again. You can see that a tuple only has 2 methods, count or index. So let's call count, and we need to put the parentheses after it to call it into action, and it needs something passed to it, one parameter, and one argument, if you will. And what I'm going to pass is another tuple holds numbers. If we look up here, we put in the number 1, 4, 2, and 8. I'm going to put in the number 2 more times. And now let's go ahead and pass in 2 to count and see what we get back. So when I run the code, we get 3. So it's actually counting how many occurrences of the number 2 are inside our another tuple. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection, and a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you, and thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.